He kissed her in front of everyone. His wife stood 10 feet away, and he kissed another woman on the mouth, slow, deliberate, like he wanted every Don in that room to see it. Victoria Callahan didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She stood with her champagne glass raised and her spine straight, while 200 of the most dangerous men in America watched her husband bury her alive in front of a chandelier that cost more than most people's houses. Then the bomb went off. If you've stayed this far, you already know this story is going to cost you sleep. Watch until the end, hit the like button, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The Meridian Grand had been standing for 61 years on the corner of 5th and 47th, and in that time it had hosted 4 presidential fundraisers, 2 foreign state dinners, and more mafia summits than anyone with a federal badge would ever confirm. The ballroom on the 14th floor, the one they called the Ivory Room because of the white marble panels imported from a quarry outside Carrara, had seen blood mopped from its floors twice in the 1980s, a poisoning in 1994 that was ruled a cardiac event, and enough whispered deals to reshape the criminal architecture of the eastern seaboard. The men who gathered here every January knew what the room was. They came anyway. Power doesn't apologize for the places it keeps. Victoria Callahan had attended the Winter Alliance Summit every year for 11 years. She'd sat through 6-course dinners beside men who smiled at her and feared her husband. She'd memorized the seating arrangements, the alliance hierarchies, the subtle signals that passed between Dons when words were too dangerous, the way Carmine Russo touched his left ear when he was lying, the way Don Pelletier of Montreal always turned his water glass 3 times before agreeing to anything. She knew these things because she had spent 11 years being invisible, and invisible women see everything. She was wearing a gown the color of deep winter, midnight blue, structured at the shoulders, a single strand of her mother's pearls at her throat. Her dark hair was swept back. She looked composed. She felt composed. That was the thing about Victoria that no one, including Ethan, had ever understood. Her stillness wasn't performance. It was architecture. Something she'd built inside herself brick by brick from the age of 9 when her father first told her that emotion was a liability in their world. Her father had been wrong about many things. About that, he'd been exactly right. She was standing near the east side of the room, speaking with Marco Delacroix, a silver-haired underboss from Chicago whose granddaughter had just started at Columbia, when the energy in the room shifted. It wasn't loud. It was the opposite. A sudden compression of sound, like the moment before a storm, when every bird goes quiet at once. Victoria felt it across the back of her neck before she turned to look. Ethan was on the raised platform at the northern end of the room. He wasn't supposed to be on the platform yet. The formal address wasn't scheduled until after the dessert course. But Ethan Callahan had never been a man who respected other people's schedules when he had something he wanted to say. He was 53 years old, and he looked like Central Casting's idea of an Irish crime boss. Jaw like a quarry shelf, silver threading through dark hair, he still wore swept back from his face, a charcoal suit that cost $12,000 and looked like he'd slept in it because he had. He was holding a microphone. His other hand was extended behind him, and connected to that hand was a woman named Sienna Voss. Victoria knew who Sienna was. She had known for 8 months. She'd found out the way she found out most things, not through a jealous source or a private investigator, but through simple observation of receipts, schedules, and the particular quality of her husband's absence. Sienna was 29. She worked for a public relations firm that handled several of the Alliance's legitimate business fronts. She was beautiful in a sharp architectural way with the kind of cheekbones and posture that made older men feel like they were acquiring something rather than just wanting it. Victoria had made no scenes. She had told no one. She had simply watched and waited and continued doing her job, which was the job no one officially acknowledged she had. The work of managing the social and political relationships that kept Ethan Callahan from being outmaneuvered by the 17 other power centers in this room. Ethan brought Sienna up onto the platform beside him. Even then, Victoria told herself it could be something else, a business introduction, an acknowledgement of some public-facing role. She made herself believe that for approximately 4 seconds, which was how long it took for Ethan to slide his hand to the small of Sienna's back, turn toward her, and press his mouth against hers in a kiss that lasted long enough that 3 people nearby physically looked away. The room didn't erupt. That was the thing that would stay with Victoria longer than any other detail from that night. The silence was worse than any reaction she could have anticipated. 200 men and their wives and their lieutenants, and the room went so quiet she could hear the ice shifting in someone's cocktail glass 20 feet away. Ethan pulled back from the kiss and faced the room. His face was the face of a man who believed he was making a declaration of strength. He believed it completely. That was the tragedy of him. He had always mistaken cruelty for confidence. I want to say something before we get into the evening's business. His voice carried without the microphone, which he held loosely at his side like a prop. I've spent a lot of years operating under obligations that no longer reflect who I am or what I want this family to stand for. Victoria and I have been finished for a long time. Tonight, I'm making that official, in front of every man in this room whose respect I value. He paused. He was letting it land. He was genuinely letting it land, like he thought this was theater and he was the lead. She's the past. What you're looking at now, he gestured at Sienna, who was smiling the careful smile of a woman who'd rehearsed this. This is the future of the Callahan name. Victoria did not move. She was aware of Marco Delacroix beside her going very still. She was aware of Don Carmine Russo across the room, setting his fork down with a sound like a small gavel strike. She was aware of 40, 50, 60 pairs of eyes sliding toward her with the specific discomfort of people watching an execution they weren't sure they were supposed to witness. She took a slow breath. Her hand was still holding the champagne glass. Her knuckles were normal. Her heart was doing something terrible and structural deep in her chest. Not breaking exactly, but reorganizing itself around a new truth that she'd known was coming and still hadn't been fully ready for. Because you're never fully ready. That's the lie people tell themselves. That they can prepare for the moment someone reduces 11 years to a sentence. She set her champagne glass down on the tray of a passing waiter with a movement so controlled it was almost elegant. And then the Meridian Grand tried to kill everyone in the room. The explosion came from below. The concussion hit the floor first, a deep, shuddering thud that traveled up through the marble and into the soles of every shoe in the ivory room, and then the windows on the south wall blew inward in a cascade of tempered glass and winter air, and then the lighting rigs dropped. Not all of them, 2 of the 4 overhead arrays, and the ivory room became a room full of smoke and screaming and the specific chaos of 200 people who had never been truly afraid discovering what it felt like. The platform at the north end of the room collapsed at its east corner. Sienna Voss screamed. It was the first real sound Victoria had heard from her all evening. Ethan grabbed Sienna. That was his first instinct. Not to assess, not to call out to his people, not to check the room. He grabbed the woman he'd just publicly crowned, and he turned his back on the ivory room, and he moved toward the emergency exit on the northwest wall, the one the Callahan security team had swept and cleared at 4 that afternoon. Victoria watched him go. A section of the ceiling, plaster and wiring, and a fragment of the ornamental molding that had hung there since 1963, came down 8 feet to her left. A woman from Don Pelletier's party went down with it, not dead. Conscious, screaming, pinned at the ankle. Victoria's dress had a tear along the left side from a piece of flying glass she hadn't registered getting hit by. She reached down, took the woman's wrist, checked her pupils, present, reactive, and then looked up at the room. The sprinkler system had activated. Water was coming down in cold sheets. The smoke was thickening from the east, which meant the secondary fire was somewhere near the kitchen corridor. She could hear 3 different alarms competing with each other, and underneath them the low, continuous sound of structural groaning that meant something above them was under serious strain. She found Paolo, her husband's head of security, standing near the collapsed section of the platform with his weapon drawn and nowhere useful to point it. Paolo was 51 and had been with the Callahan operation for 22 years, and right now he looked exactly like what he was, a man trained to handle physical threats who was facing a threat that had no face. Paolo, her voice cut through the noise. He turned. How many exits? 4. North is clear. East is compromised. The fire's coming from that corridor. South windows are blown. West? Intact. Get every Dawn to the west stairwell. Personal security forms a perimeter. Do not use the elevator. Do you understand me?" He stared at her for a second that under other circumstances might have been about the fact that she was not, technically, in his chain of command. Then something shifted in his face, and he nodded and moved. She turned back to the woman pinned under the debris. The molding fragment had pinned but not crushed. The ankle was wrong, but the blood loss was manageable. Victoria used the length of fabric from her torn hem. She had to tear it further, which she did without hesitating, and tied a compression wrap around the ankle with the efficient knots her father had made her learn from a field medic before she was 12. Don Carmine Russo appeared at her shoulder. He was 71 and had survived 4 attempts on his life, and he looked, right now, completely calm. He crouched without being asked and helped her lift the plaster section enough to drag the woman free. "Where's your husband?" he asked. "He left," Victoria said. Russo looked at her. Whatever he saw on her face, he didn't comment on it. He helped her move the woman to a clear section of floor and then stood. "What do you need?" "I need someone to help me get Don Pelletier's table out. His wife is still in there." She pointed through the thickening smoke toward the east section, where 2 tables had gone over. "And I need you to make sure the Chicago contingent stays together. Your people tend to fragment under pressure, and if anyone goes east looking for an exit, they're moving toward the fire." Russo looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he said, "All right," and moved. She spent the next 40 minutes inside the worst of it. She didn't think about Ethan during that time. She couldn't afford to. There were 9 people with injuries that needed immediate triage, 2 structural collapses in the south section of the room that needed to be routed around, a fire that the building's suppression system was containing but not extinguishing, and 17 senior figures in the American Mafia Alliance who needed to exit a compromised building without being photographed by the press that was assembling 14 floors below. She coordinated with Paolo. She directed Don Pelletier's security through a relay system because Pelletier's headman spoke only French, and Victoria's French was functional, if not fluent. She talked a 63-year-old underboss from New Jersey named Frank Caruso through a panic attack in the west stairwell landing. Not gently, but practically, the way you talk someone through a thing when there isn't time for gentleness. She told him to breathe through his nose. She told him he'd survived worse. She told him she needed him upright because his men were watching him and they'd fall apart if he did. He got upright. By the time NYPD and fire department arrived in force, the occupants of the Ivory Room were in the street, largely accounted for, with the 9 injured loaded into vehicles that were already moving toward Lenox Hill under the discreet arrangements that the Alliance maintained for exactly this kind of situation. No one was dead. 11 years ago, in a similar incident in Boston, a less targeted, more chaotic event, 4 men had died in the stampede alone. Tonight, no one was dead. Victoria stood in the cold January air on 47th Street, with the Meridian Grand smoking behind her and her midnight blue gown destroyed and her mother's pearls somehow still intact at her throat. Her hands were not shaking. She had passed the point of shaking sometime in the 3rd-floor stairwell and come out the other side into the particular clarity that follows pure crisis. Don Carmine Russo stood beside her. He had blood on his cuff from where he'd helped move someone, and he hadn't mentioned it once. "The east section," he said. "The charge placement. That wasn't random." "No," she agreed. Someone knew the room layout, knew where to put it to maximize confusion without maximizing casualties. Which means they didn't want everyone dead. They wanted everyone frightened. Russo was quiet for a moment. In the distance, another siren. The press was being held back by a line of NYPD a full block north, but Victoria could see the cameras. "A message," he said. "A test," she corrected. He turned to look at her. Full on, direct. The kind of look that had about 3 different calculations in it at once. "Who passes a test like this?" Victoria didn't answer that question directly. She turned her eyes back toward the smoking building and said, "Get your people somewhere clean and get them fed. Everyone is going to be on edge for the next 72 hours. I'll have a full assessment ready before morning. You'll have—" He stopped, started again. "Where is Ethan?" She had been waiting for that question. She had been, in some part of herself, dreading it. "I don't know," she said, "but I know where his second car is parked." She pulled her phone from the small clutch that had survived the night attached to her wrist, and she scrolled to a number she had not used before. The man on the other end answered on the second ring, which meant he'd been expecting her call, which meant he'd been watching, which meant this evening was several things simultaneously: accident, test, and confirmation. And at least one of those things had been prepared for. "Tell me it's clean," she said. The man on the other end said, "Sienna Voss cleared the east exit 18 minutes before the charge went off." Victoria said nothing for 4 seconds. "She was on the platform," Victoria said carefully. "She was on the platform," he agreed, "but her phone pinged the third-floor service corridor at 6:42, 18 minutes before the blast." Victoria looked up at the Meridian Grand, at the smoke still threading from the blown-out south windows, at the building where she had just spent 40 minutes keeping 200 people alive while her husband carried another woman out a fire exit. "Don't move," she said into the phone. "Don't speak to anyone. I'll call you again in an hour." She ended the call. Don Russo was watching her. He was a careful man, careful enough not to ask what he'd just witnessed, but his eyes said the question clearly enough. Victoria put her phone away. She looked at Russo with the same steady expression she'd worn when Ethan kissed that woman in front of the room. Not blank, not performing, but controlled in that architectural way that was simply how she was built. "Carmine," she said, and she used his first name deliberately, because she was past the formalities now. "The bombing wasn't from outside the Alliance." Russo went very still. "And Ethan didn't know," she continued, "which means someone in this room used him. Used what he did tonight, used the chaos, used the moment, because they knew he'd give them one." She let that settle. "And now I need to figure out who had access to the building layout, who knew our security protocols, and who was standing close enough to Ethan for the last 3 months to know that he was going to make a spectacle of himself tonight." Russo's voice came out quiet. "You already know." "I have a very strong direction," she said. "What? That's not the same thing." "What do you need?" She looked at the building one last time, at the room where Ethan had buried her in public, and she had spent the next 40 minutes refusing to stay buried. "First," she said, "I need a car. Second, I need every guest list, every vendor permit, every contracted worker who had access to this building in the last 2 weeks." Her breath came out white in the January cold. "And third, I need you to not tell anyone what I just told you, not even your own people, not tonight." He nodded once. She turned and walked toward the waiting vehicles. Behind her, the Meridian Grand was still burning in pieces, and above the city, the sky was that particular New York January black that swallowed everything and gave nothing back. And somewhere in a car she hadn't gotten to yet was a woman who had been on a stage when a bomb went off, but whose phone had been 3 floors below. Victoria did not know yet exactly what she was walking toward, but she was walking. That was the thing about her that Ethan had never understood, not in 11 years of watching her absorb everything and give very little back. Victoria Callahan did not stop when things collapsed. She reorganized and she moved, and she had just been given, in the wreckage of the worst night of her marriage, the most important piece of information she had ever held. And she had absolutely no intention of wasting it. The car smelled like cigarette smoke and wet wool, and the particular staleness of a vehicle that had been sitting in a parking garage for 4 hours with the heat running. Victoria got in the back without speaking. The driver, one of Russo's men, a young guy with a scar through his left eyebrow who hadn't been introduced and didn't introduce himself, pulled out of the underground structure on 46th Street and into the cold grid of Midtown at 11:40 on a January night that had already lasted about 3 lifetimes. She had her phone in her lap. She had 4 missed calls from Ethan's personal line and 1 from his chief of staff, a man named Gerald Price, who had been managing Ethan's calendar and conscience for 16 years, and who had the specific quality of institutional loyalty that made him useful and dangerous in roughly equal measure. She ignored all of them and pulled up the contacts she'd used outside the Meridian Grand. His name in her phone was listed as D. Marsh. His real name was Daniel Marsh, and he had been, until 14 months ago, a senior intelligence analyst for the Alliance's Internal Security Division, the off-books apparatus that every major crime organization maintained under various names for the purposes of counterintelligence and threat assessment. Ethan had pushed him out during a restructuring that had less to do with performance and more to do with the fact that Marsh had once, in a private debrief, suggested that Ethan's association with a particular public relations firm represented a potential security exposure. Victoria had kept Marsh on a private retainer 6 weeks after he was terminated. She had not told Ethan. She called him now. He picked up on the first ring this time. "I'm at the location you told me to hold. Tell me everything you have on Voss." The car turned north on 6th Avenue. Outside, the city moved past in its usual indifferent way. Cabs, delivery trucks, a group of people in formal wear outside a restaurant who hadn't heard yet that the Meridian Grand was still on fire. And Victoria listened while Marsh talked, and the picture that assembled itself in the space between his words was worse than she'd expected, and she had already expected something bad. Sienna Voss had joined the PR firm, a company called Meridian Group, which was a name that now carried a particular sick irony, 19 months ago. Her background check had been run by the Alliance's standard vetting process, which meant it had gone through a man named Curtis Hale, who ran the administrative arm of Ethan's operation. Her references had cleared. Her financial history had cleared. Everything had cleared, which Marsh said in the tone of someone who understood that when everything clears, it's because someone made it clear. "Who vouched for her?" Victoria asked. Curtis Hale signed off, but the initial referral— Marsh paused, and Victoria could hear him moving, paper sounds. The specific noise of a man consulting physical notes in a small space came from Thomas Draper. Victoria didn't say anything for a moment. Thomas Draper was the head of the Draper family out of Philadelphia. He was 58, second generation, had spent 12 years building a reputation as a moderate voice in the Alliance. The man who preferred negotiation to escalation, who showed up to every summit with gifts for everyone's wives, and remembered the names of children. He sat on the Alliance's internal arbitration panel. He had attended Ethan and Victoria's wedding. "How solid is that?" she asked. "Solid enough that I sat on it for 3 weeks before I called you tonight," Marsh said. "I needed it to be wrong. It's not wrong." She looked out the window at a red light. A woman was walking a dog on the sidewalk, moving fast in the cold, the dog pulling towards something in the gutter. Ordinary. The most ordinary thing in the world. "The charge placement," Victoria said. "Can you tie it?" Not to Draper directly, but the building contractor who had access to the 14th floor for the week before the summit, a firm called Arcline Facilities, subcontracts through a holding company that Draper's legitimate real estate arm uses for 3 of its commercial properties in Delaware. That's circumstantial. Everything I have right now is circumstantial. That's why I need more time, and why you need to not let anyone inside the Alliance know what direction you're looking. How long? 48 hours. Maybe 72. The light changed. The car moved. "You have 36, she said. "Because after 36 hours, Ethan is going to start making moves to reassert control, and whatever he does in that window is going to either collapse the investigation or compromise it. He doesn't know what he doesn't know, and right now what he doesn't know is keeping him from doing something irreversible." Marsh was quiet for a moment. "He's going to figure out you're running something. He's going to be too busy managing what happened in that room tonight to look at me very carefully." She paused. "For maybe 48 hours. So 36 is what we have." She ended the call. The hotel Russo had arranged was a property the Alliance used for exactly this kind of situation. A clean, anonymous address on the Upper East Side, the kind of place that had a dedicated service entrance and a staff trained to be professionally incurious. Victoria's room was on the 8th floor. It had a window that faced a brick wall and a minibar and a bed she had no intention of sleeping in, and a desk where she sat down at 12:40 in the morning with a legal pad and a pen and started building a map of the last 19 months. She worked for 2 hours. She ordered coffee from room service, and it arrived and she drank it without tasting it and kept writing. By 2:30, she had 7 pages and a headache that started at the base of her skull and worked forward. And what she had on those 7 pages was not yet proof of anything, but it was the shape of something, the outline of a plan that had been running parallel to her marriage, parallel to the Alliance, parallel to everything Ethan thought he was building, and that had used Ethan's specific vanities and specific hungers the way a lockpick uses the particular weaknesses in a particular lock. Someone had seen Ethan's obsession with Sienna Voss, and decided to make it structural, make it load-bearing, build something around it that would collapse when it collapsed, which was always going to be eventually, because that was what happened with men like Ethan, and obsessions like that. She stopped writing at 2:50 when her phone rang. Not Marsh, not Russo. Ethan. She looked at his name on the screen for the full duration of the first ring, picked up on the second. "Where are you?" His voice was flat in the way that with Ethan meant the opposite of calm. "Somewhere safe," she said, "which is more than I can say for the ivory room. I need to see you." "That's interesting." "Victoria." "You left me in a burning building, Ethan." She said it without heat, without anything, really, just the words arranged in their factual order. "You left me under a collapsed ceiling section in a room with active structural damage, and you carried Sienna Voss out the north exit, in front of every Don in the Alliance." The silence on his end lasted about 4 seconds, which was 3 seconds longer than it should have if his first instinct had been to deny it. "The situation was—" "I'm not interested in what the situation was," she said. "I'm interested in where we are now, which is that your Alliance is going to be asking questions in the morning, and the answers you have are not the answers they're going to want to hear. So you can either talk to me now while there's still something to salvage, or you can manage this alone and we'll see how that goes." Another silence. She could hear him breathing. She could hear something in the background, a television, low, or voices. She couldn't tell. "Come to the Greystone," he said. The Greystone was a property the Callahan operation maintained on East 71st, a brownstone that served as Ethan's private base in the city. "Tonight." "No," she said. "Victoria. I'll meet you at the Park Avenue office at 8 in the morning. Come alone. Gerald can wait outside." She paused. "And Ethan? Whatever you're doing right now, whatever conversation you think you need to have tonight to get ahead of this, don't. Every move you make in the next 6 hours is going to be examined, and it needs to look like a man who is shaken and cooperating, not a man who is managing." The breathing on his end. The background noise. "You always did think 3 moves ahead," he said, and she couldn't tell if it was an accusation or something that was almost admiration. "I thought 4, she said. "Good night, Ethan." She hung up and sat with the phone in her hand and the headache and the legal pad and the 2:43 in the morning quiet of a hotel room she was in because her husband had publicly declared her dead weight and then walked away from her in the literal smoke of someone else's scheme. She did not cry. She thought about it, or her body thought about it. Her chest did the preliminary work, the tightening. And then she breathed through it the way she'd told Frank Caruso to breathe through his panic attack in the stairwell, nose, deliberate, and it passed. She picked up the pen and kept writing. At 7:15 the next morning, she was at the Park Avenue office, which occupied the top 2 floors of a building that officially belonged to a property development company and unofficially served as the administrative center for the Callahan operation's legitimate and not legitimate interests. The receptionist, a woman named Anne who had been there for 12 years and who would sooner eat glass than comment on anything she witnessed in those offices, brought Victoria coffee without being asked and didn't mention her appearance, which was same gown, tear and all, with a wool coat borrowed from Russo's wife that was 2 sizes too large and dark enough to pass at a distance. Ethan arrived at 8:04. He was alone. He looked like a man who hadn't slept and was angry about it, which was different from a man who hadn't slept and was scared, which was what Victoria needed to determine in the first 60 seconds of seeing his face. He was scared. The anger was real, but it was on top of the fear the way a tarp goes over something you don't want people to see. He sat down across from her at the long table in the main conference room. Gerald Price had, in fact, been made to wait outside. Ethan's jaw was working. He hadn't shaved. He'd changed clothes, which meant he'd been somewhere with a change of clothes, which meant he'd been at the Greystone or somewhere similar, which meant Sienna Voss had either been with him or had been specifically not with him in a way that was its own kind of information. "Is she safe?" Victoria asked. He looked up. "What?" "Sienna. Is she somewhere safe?" The look on his face went through 3 things fast: surprise, defensiveness, something that might have been shame if it had been given enough room to breathe. "She's at her apartment. I had 2 men on the door." "Pull them," Victoria said. "Excuse me?" "Pull your men off her door, Ethan, right now, today. Because in approximately 36 hours, the Alliance investigation is going to start looking at everyone who was on that platform, and your personal security detail sitting outside her apartment is going to read as either complicity or obstruction, neither of which you can afford. He stared at her. You think she's involved? Victoria looked at him steadily. I think you need to distance yourself from her publicly and privately until the investigation is complete. I think you need to do it now, before anyone asks you to, because if you do it before they ask, it looks like judgment, and if you do it after, it looks like guilt. That's not an answer. No, she agreed. It isn't. He pushed back from the table, stood up. He was a physically large man, and he used that in moments like this, filled a room with the fact of himself. And there had been a time when that had affected her in some complicated way, and now it just looked like a man taking up space. What do you want? He asked. Just say it. What do you want from me right now? I want you to sit down, she said. And I want you to tell me every conversation you had with Thomas Draper in the last 6 months. Ethan didn't sit down. He went very still in the way that large men go still when something has surprised them past the point of immediate reaction. The name. She could see it hit him. Not like she'd accused him of something, but like she'd named the specific shape of a fear he'd already had and hadn't looked directly at yet. Why Draper? He said. It wasn't a question. Sit down, she said again. He sat. She told him enough, not everything. She wasn't ready to put everything in front of Ethan because Ethan's reactions were not always predictable, and what he did with information depended heavily on what he felt about it, and right now he was feeling too many things at once for that to be safe. But she gave him the outline, the contractor, the access, the referral chain that led back to Philadelphia. She watched his face while she talked. She was good at that, had spent 11 years getting good at it. The tells were small, the jaw muscle, the way his hands, flat on the table, pressed slightly harder on the wood at certain words, the particular way his eyes stopped tracking and went internal, which with Ethan meant he was pulling up a memory and checking it against what he was being told. When she finished, he said, he was at every preparatory meeting. I know. He suggested the Meridian Grand. He pushed for that venue when Caruso wanted the Carlisle. Victoria kept her face neutral. She had not known that. She wrote it mentally on the list. He was also the one who... Ethan stopped. His jaw worked. He told me the Alliance was ready to accept a change, in my personal situation, that there'd been private conversations among the senior Dons, and the consensus was that my... He searched for a word. Domestic arrangements were a source of instability, and that formalizing something would actually strengthen my position. The room felt very quiet. He told you the Dons would support you introducing Sienna, Victoria said. He told me they'd prefer it to the current situation. Ethan's voice had gone flat and cold. He told me last night was the right moment, a controlled declaration in front of the Alliance. He said it would read as strength. Victoria set her pen down very carefully on the table. There it was, the clean center of it. Someone had told Ethan Callahan exactly what to do and exactly when to do it. And Ethan, whose greatest weakness had always been his need to be seen as decisive and unafraid of consequences, had done it. He had kissed Sienna Voss on a stage in front of 200 men, and 8 minutes later a bomb had gone off, and the question of who would be blamed for the chaos and who had the authority to respond and whether the head of the Callahan family was fit to lead, all of that had been rearranged in the smoke. He set you up, she said. Ethan didn't answer. His face said the answer. His face said, I know. His face said, I walked into it, and I cannot fully hold the shape of how completely I walked into it. He didn't try to kill you, Victoria continued. That's the important part. He didn't need you dead. He needed you discredited. He needed you to look like a man who chose his personal life over his responsibilities under pressure. He needed the Alliance to watch you carry Sienna out of that room and leave me in it, because that image is the thing that follows you now. That's the thing every Don in that building is going to be carrying with them into every conversation about your leadership for the rest of the year. Ethan's hands were no longer flat on the table. They were gripped, one around the other, hard enough that the knuckles had shifted toward white. What does he want? Ethan said. I think he wants the chair, she said simply. The next 12 hours were the kind that hollowed you out. Victoria moved between 3 locations: the Park Avenue office, a second meeting with Russo at a restaurant in the East 50s that Russo had used for private conversations for 30 years, and a call with Marsh that she took standing in the cold in a parking structure on 53rd because it was the only place she was confident wasn't monitored. Marsh had more. He had the phone records that placed a burner registered to an Arcline employee in the same cell tower cluster as the Meridian Grand's 4th-floor service corridor on the night of the summit. He had a financial transfer, small, constructed to look like a consulting payment, from a Delaware LLC that traced back through 2 layers to a holding company with Draper family connections. He had a text exchange, recovered from a wiped phone belonging to a mid-level Draper operative, that referenced the platform event 11 days before the summit. None of it was the kind of clean that held up in a court of law. In the court that mattered, the judgment of the Alliance's senior membership, it was close to enough. "I need one more thing," she told Marsh. "I need to know if Sienna was a knowing participant or a planted asset who was managed without full information." "Why does that distinction matter to you right now?" She thought about the way Sienna had been on that stage, the prepared smile, the performance of it, and then the scream when the platform collapsed, real, uncontrolled, the scream of someone who had not expected the floor to move. "Because if she didn't know, she's also a victim," Victoria said. "And I'm not going to use a victim." Marsh was quiet. "I'll find out," he said. She was on her way back to the Park Avenue office at 6 in the evening when Gerald Price called her directly. Not Ethan's line, his own, and she answered because Price calling her directly was so far outside normal protocol that it was its own kind of alarm. "There's an emergency council meeting," he said without preamble. "Tonight," Russo called it, 8 o'clock. Who was notified? Everyone above the rank of capo, every family represented at the summit. A pause. "Mrs. Callahan, Ethan doesn't know I'm telling you this, but the agenda that Russo circulated, the item listed as 3rd on that agenda, is a motion to open a formal review of Callahan family leadership." She stopped walking. She was on the sidewalk on Park Avenue with the evening traffic moving around her and the cold coming up through the soles of her shoes. "Russo called the meeting?" she said. "Yes, ma'am." She had spent 2 hours with Carmine Russo last night. She had told him Draper. She had told him to tell no one. She had trusted the judgment of a man she'd known for 11 years because he had crouched down beside her in a burning room and helped her lift a piece of rubble off a frightened woman's leg. "Thank you, Gerald," she said. She hung up and stood on the sidewalk and breathed through it. Nose, deliberate, and then she called Russo. He answered on the 3rd ring. "Victoria." "You called the meeting," she said. "I did." "I told you to wait. You told me not to tell anyone what direction you were looking," he said. "I didn't. The meeting isn't about Draper. The meeting is about Ethan. Those are 2 different things." She wanted to argue that. She was already building the argument, but somewhere underneath the anger was the recognition that he wasn't wrong, that Ethan's fitness for leadership was a separate question from who had set last night in motion, and that the Alliance's senior members had the right to ask it, and that if she tried to hold that question closed, she would look like what she was not, a loyal wife protecting a man who'd publicly discarded her. "What's on the agenda after the review motion?" she asked. "Security briefing, and then," he paused, "and then your name is on it." "My name." Don Pelletier put it there. After what you did last night, he put your name on the agenda as a proposed interim coordinator for the investigation response. Another pause, different from the first one. "I didn't oppose it." The traffic moved around her. Someone honked, far away, at nothing or everything. "Carmine," she said slowly, "if I walk into that meeting tonight, I am making a choice that I cannot unmake. You understand that?" "Yes," he said. "Ethan will see it as a move against him." "Ethan," Russo said, in the voice of a man who had been in this business for 40 years and was very tired of certain things, should have thought about that before he carried another woman out of a building and left his wife in the wreckage. She stood there in the cold and let the full weight of it settle. Not the decision itself, which had been made sometime around 2:30 in the morning on a legal pad in a hotel room. She understood that now. but the acknowledgement of it. The moment when you stop being the thing that happened to you and start being the thing you chose. "I'll be there at 8, she said. She was walking back toward the office, already building in her head what she needed to say and how she needed to say it and what order the information needed to arrive in, when her phone buzzed with a message from Marsh. 4 words. Voss didn't know. Confirmed. She stopped. Read it again. Felt something in her chest that was not quite relief and not quite something else. The specific feeling of a fact that doesn't make anything easier but makes you feel marginally less contaminated by what you're about to do. She kept walking. At 7:50, she was in the elevator going up to the floor where the emergency council meeting was being held. A private room in a building on Lexington that the Alliance used for exactly this kind of gathering, anonymous, clean, defensible. When the elevator stopped at the 4th floor and the doors opened and Ethan was standing there. He looked at her. She looked at him. The elevator held, he stepped in, the doors closed. For 10 floors they didn't speak. She could feel the heat of his anger and underneath it the colder thing that was something else. Not quite fear, not quite the thing a man feels when he realizes too late that the center of a situation has shifted away from him in the dark. His jaw was set. His eyes were forward. "You're going in," he said. Not a question. "Yes. They're going to use you against me. They're going to use what you did against you," she said. "I'm just going to be in the room." The elevator reached the 14th floor. The doors opened. Down the corridor, she could see the light under the meeting room door, hear the low movement of voices going quiet. Ethan's hand came out. Not to stop her, not quite, but to her arm. A grip that was harder than it needed to be and less hard than he probably wanted it to be. "Victoria." His voice was rough. "If you walk through that door, there's no going back. For either of us. You know that." She looked down at his hand on her arm. She looked up at his face. She thought about a stage and a microphone and a kiss that was designed to bury her. "Ethan," she said quietly, "I stopped going back at approximately 9:47 last night." She removed his hand from her arm with 2 fingers, precisely, without hurry, and she walked down the corridor toward the light under the door, and behind her she heard the elevator doors close, and ahead of her she heard the voices in the room go fully silent as someone near the door became aware of her approach, and what waited for her on the other side of that door was not safety and not comfort and not any version of the life she had organized herself around for 11 years. What waited for her was the point she could not come back from. She put her hand on the door. She opened the door. The room was rectangular, low-ceilinged, lit by overhead panels that gave everything the flat quality of an operating theater. 12 men were seated around a table that had been brought in specifically for gatherings like this. Dark wood, no branding, no identifying marks. 3 more stood along the south wall. Every head turned when she entered, and the quality of the silence that followed was different from the silence in the ivory room the night before. That silence had been shock. This silence was assessment. Don Pelletier was at the far end of the table. He was 66, from Montreal, and he had the particular quality of stillness that Victoria associated with men who had made a great many irreversible decisions and had learned to carry them without visible weight. He had a bandage on his left forearm from the previous night. He nodded when she entered. A single, deliberate nod, the kind that meant, "I expected you, and the fact that you came tells me what I needed to know." Carmine Russo was to Pelletier's left. He did not nod. He looked at her with the expression of a man who understood that what he'd set in motion was real now, and that real things had weight, and that weight was distributed. She took the empty chair at the table's midpoint, the one that had been left empty, she understood, deliberately. Not the head, not the foot, the center. Don Frank Caruso from New Jersey was across from her. He looked better than he had in the stairwell. He also looked like a man who had something to say and was deciding whether to say it now or later, which with Caruso usually meant now. "You look like you've been up all night," he said. "I have," she said. "You look better than Ethan." No one responded to that. It settled into the room and stayed there. Pelletier cleared his throat. "We should begin." His English carried the specific precision of a man who had learned it as a third language and was therefore more careful with it than most native speakers. Mrs. Callahan, you are here at my request and with the agreement of the room. You are not here in any formal capacity. That distinction matters. Understood, she said. The question before this council is whether the events of last night, the bombing, the response, and the decisions made by the head of the Callahan family, both before and during the incident, constitute grounds for a formal review of Callahan's standing within the alliance. He looked at her directly. I want your perspective before we proceed. The room waited. She could feel it. The specific collective attention of men who were accustomed to controlling everything and were, for this particular moment, choosing to listen instead. She put both hands flat on the table. The bombing was not a random attack, she said. It was targeted, precision-placed to maximize chaos and minimize casualties, which tells you the objective was not to eliminate leadership, but to expose it. Specifically to expose how leadership behaves under uncontrolled pressure. She paused. That should tell you something about where the attack originated and what the attacker wanted to see. We already know it wasn't random, said a man named DiStefano from the Boston contingent. He was blunt in the way that some men used as a substitute for intelligence, and some men used in addition to it, and with DiStefano it was the latter. What we want to know is who ordered it. I have a direction, she said. A direction isn't a name. No, she agreed. But a name without evidence is an accusation, and an accusation in this room without evidence is the kind of thing that starts the war we're all trying to prevent. She let that settle. I need 36 hours. I have an active investigation. I have sources and documentation. In 36 hours, I can give you a name with something behind it.
The
room moved, not physically, but in the way rooms move when a proposal lands and people start calculating against it. Pelletier said, And Ethan? There it was. Ethan made choices last night that I cannot defend, she said. What he did on that stage was his choice. What he did when that building started to collapse was his choice. I was in the room. I saw both. She breathed in through her nose. I am not here to protect him from the consequences of his choices. I'm here because the Alliance needs to stay functional while those consequences are being processed. And right now the investigation is the most important thing. DiStefano. You're asking us to hold the Callahan review. I'm asking you to not let it compromise the investigation. They are related, but they're not the same thing. Handle them in sequence. Russo spoke for the first time. She's right. His voice carried the specific gravity of a man who had been in the room for more of these conversations than anyone else. We move on the investigation. Callahan review follows when we have the full picture. Those are my terms. A moment. Then Pelletier. Agreed. Around the table, the acknowledgement moved. Not unanimous, but sufficient. She left the meeting at 9:40 with the investigation formally under her coordination, which was a title that didn't exist an hour ago and still had no official standing within the Alliance's documented structure and was nonetheless completely real in the way that things in this world became real, through the consent of the room. Outside in the corridor, she let herself lean against the wall for approximately 4 seconds. Let the weight of the last 22 hours sit in her legs. Her left side still ached from the glass fragment. She was wearing a coat that didn't fit, and shoes that had now been on her feet for over 12 hours. She was operating on 2 hours of sleep and hotel coffee. She pushed off the wall and called Marsh. It's done, she said. I have the room. What do you need? Access to the Alliance's vendor records for the Meridian Grand contract. Building permits, contractor logs, everything that went through the administrative approval process. That goes through Curtis Hale, which is a problem. She thought about Curtis Hale, 16 years with the Callahan operation. The man who had signed off on Sienna Voss's background check. The man whose desk every vendor approval crossed before it was filed. How big of a problem? She asked. Marsh's pause was the answer before his words were. I pulled his financials tonight. There's a pattern. Small amounts, irregular intervals, coming through a payroll account belonging to a staffing company in Delaware. Not the same LLC as the contractor trail. Different vehicle, same geography. She closed her eyes, opened them. He's been on Draper's payroll, she said, for at least 8 months, possibly longer. That's just how far back I got tonight. Curtis Hale, who scheduled Ethan's meetings, who managed the administrative bloodstream of the entire Callahan operation, who had been sitting in the Park Avenue office this morning, 20 feet from the room where she and Ethan had their conversation about Thomas Draper. He knows we're looking at Draper, she said. If he was monitoring the office, yes. The corridor was empty. The overhead light hummed. How fast can Draper move? She asked. Fast enough, Marsh said. If Hale told him tonight and Draper decides to cut his losses, he'll move on the evidence before we can secure it. Or he'll move on you. She stood with that for a moment, the specific feeling of a board shifting under your feet mid-step, when the thing you thought was floor turns out to be something that moves. Where are you right now? She asked. 53rd and Lex, in my car. Don't go home tonight. Don't go anywhere predictable. Take the documentation you have and put it somewhere it can be accessed without you. She was already moving toward the elevator. Physical copies, not just digital. And Marsh, if you can't reach me in the next 4 hours, you go directly to Russo. Understood. A beat. Victoria. It was the first time he'd used her first name. Be careful, he said. She took the elevator down alone. At 11:15 that night, the second attack happened. It wasn't an explosion. It was quieter than that, and in some ways worse. A targeted operation against two of the Draper family's primary competitors in the Philadelphia corridor, carried out with a precision that suggested pre-planning and available resources. 2 men were shot. Neither died. Both were senior figures in families aligned with the Alliance. And by midnight, the message had reached every senior Don through the informal network that the Alliance maintained for exactly this kind of rapid communication. The Draper family had not been behind the Meridian Grand attack. The Draper family had themselves been targeted. Victoria heard it in a call from Russo at 11:42. She was in a car. Russo's driver again, the young man with the scar, who had apparently been assigned to her for the duration, moving through the Midtown grid with the legal pad on her knee and nothing on it that still meant what she'd thought it meant an hour ago. She made Russo repeat it. He did. The 2 men who were hit, she said. Who ordered the protection detail on them? That would have come through the Alliance Security Coordination, which, since last night, has been... He stopped. Which has been me, she said. The silence on his end was the particular silence of a man who understood what he was hearing. She had been handed coordination of the investigation. She had, in accepting that role, also assumed nominal oversight of security disposition for the Alliance's senior members. She had not yet had time to issue any actual directives. It had been 4 hours, she had been in a meeting for 2 of them, but on paper, on the record that would be examined, she was the coordinator. And 2 protected men had just been shot. Someone moved on them before I could cover them, she said. Her voice was even. It took effort. Or someone moved on them knowing that you were the coordinator, Russo said quietly. She looked out the car window. The city moved past, a diner, a dry cleaner, a couple walking fast against the cold, a trash truck, and she breathed through the specific nausea of understanding that she had been walked into something. Draper, she said, is now presenting himself as a victim, Russo finished. His people are already making calls. He's positioning as the target of an unknown aggressor, and the failure to protect the other 2 men gets laid at my door. He moves fast, Russo said. It wasn't admiration. It was the opposite. She pressed her fingers against her eyes. 3 seconds. Then she took her hand away. The Meridian Grand attack and tonight's shooting, they're the same operation, but they're not the same objective, she said. The Grand was about discrediting Ethan. Tonight is about discrediting me. Which means Draper didn't know about me until last night, Russo said. Until she walked into that meeting room. Until she stood up in front of every Don above capo rank and made herself visible. Until she stopped being the invisible woman who saw everything and became something that could be targeted. Carmine? She kept her voice level. I need to know something and I need you to answer me without choosing your words. A beat. All right. Did anyone in that meeting room know I was being brought in before Pelletier stood up? The pause that followed was 4 seconds long, which was 2 seconds longer than a man needed to answer if the answer was simply no. Pelletier's assistant sent a pre-meeting brief to all attendees, Russo said carefully. Your name was on it as an invitee. Who has access to Pelletier's assistant's communications? The 4-second pause again. Carmine, she said. Pelletier's operation uses a shared administrative server, Russo said. The access architecture said, I don't know the specifics, but it would not be impossible for someone with the right resources. To know I was coming before I arrived, she said. She ended the call. She sat in the moving car and she let the full shape of it land, not in pieces, not processed carefully, but all at once, the way cold water lands when someone throws it. The Meridian Grand hadn't just been about Ethan, or it had been, initially. But somewhere in the planning, someone had understood that Ethan alone was not the endgame. Ethan was the first move. The second move required someone to step into the chaos he left behind, and the second move required that someone to be positioned where they could be compromised. They had needed her to stand up. They had arranged for someone to invite her, Pelletier, who was not complicit but whose operation had been penetrated. And they had needed her visible and officially responsible, and then they had moved the chess piece that put 2 men in the hospital on her watch. She was not the investigator. She was the next target. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. She answered. The voice on the other end was a man's. Not Marsh, not anyone she recognized. Measured and without inflection, the voice of someone reading from an internal script. Mrs. Callahan, you should know that Daniel Marsh was in a car accident on 53rd Street 18 minutes ago. He's alive. He'll stay alive if you end your involvement in the current investigation and communicate that decision to the council within the next 2 hours. The call ended. She looked at the phone in her hand. The screen showed, call ended, 014. Stop the car, she said. The driver stopped. They were on a side street off Lexington, between a parking garage and a building with dark windows. The engine idled. The heat ran. Outside, a wind moved a piece of newspaper across the empty sidewalk. She sat with it for exactly 60 seconds. She counted them, not because counting helped, but because she needed her mind occupied with something simple and sequential while the rest of it processed. Marsh, who had the documentation? Who was the only person besides herself who held the complete evidentiary thread connecting the contractor trail to the Delaware LLC to the Draper family payroll signatures? Who had been in his car on 53rd and Lexington when she'd spoken to him 40 minutes ago, and who had now been in a car accident that was not an accident. The documentation existed in 2 places, with Marsh and wherever he had put the physical copies she'd told him to secure. She did not know where those copies were. She had told him to put them somewhere accessible without him, and then she had hung up, and now she had no way to reach him, and she had 2 hours before they expected an answer. She breathed in, breathed out. She thought about Russo, about whether she could trust him, and she realized the flaw in that thinking. It wasn't about trust, it was about exposure. Whoever had penetrated Pelletier's administrative server had resources and access that indicated deep alliance infrastructure knowledge. She could not assume any channel was clean. She could not assume any person was unobserved. She was thinking in the wrong direction, she realized. She had spent the last 18 hours thinking like an investigator. She needed to stop. She needed to think like the thing she actually was. The driver was watching her in the rearview mirror, the scar through his left eyebrow, Russo's man. She had been in this car for most of the last 20 hours, and she had never asked his name. "What's your name?" she said. He blinked. "Marco, ma'am." "Marco, I need you to take me somewhere, and I need you to not tell anyone, including your boss, where you've taken me until I tell you you can. Can you do that?" He looked at her in the mirror. She looked back. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "East 71st, she said. "The Greystone." Ethan's brownstone. The place she'd refused to go the night before. The place that felt 24 hours ago like the wrong direction. She needed to go back to the beginning. She needed the one person who had been inside Thomas Draper's confidence for the last 6 months. She needed the conversations, the specific words, the details that only existed in Ethan Callahan's memory and that no encrypted document or financial transfer could provide. She needed Ethan, not as her husband. She had already closed that door in the elevator corridor. She needed him as a source, the only source she had left, who was still breathing and uncompromised and who had something Draper didn't know he'd given away. The Greystone was dark from the street except for one light in the second-floor front room. She had Marco stop half a block short, and she walked the rest, quickly, in the cold, her borrowed coat pulled tight. She rang the bell. 12 seconds passed. She rang it again. The intercom crackled. Ethan's voice, rough and raw in a way she'd never heard it through a speaker before. "What?" "It's me," she said. A beat. "The camera's right there. I can see it's you." "Then open the door, Ethan." The lock released. He met her in the entrance hall in a shirt and dark trousers, no jacket, barefoot on the dark hardwood floor. He looked like a man who had been sitting in a room with a glass for several hours, though she didn't see a glass and he didn't smell like one. Ethan's relationship with alcohol had always been the kind that hid well. His eyes were clear. They moved over her with the specific quality of assessment she recognized from 1,000 interactions. Not warmth, not anger, something more mechanical. The way he looked at things when he was frightened and didn't want to show it. "You went to the meeting," he said. "I did. And then 2 men got shot." "That wasn't," she started. "I know it wasn't you," he said. His voice was flat. "Give me some credit." She stepped fully into the entrance hall. He closed the door behind her. The house smelled like him, like the specific combination of soap and paper and the trace of tobacco he'd never fully given up. And she registered that and set it aside because it was not relevant. "Draper moved faster than I anticipated," she said. "He has someone inside Pelletier's administrative operation. He knew about me before I was in the room, and now he's put Marsh in a hospital and he's given me 2 hours to walk away from the investigation." Ethan's jaw tightened. "How bad is Marsh?" "I don't know yet." "And you came here because I need the conversations," she said. "Everything Draper said to you in the last 6 months. Not the summary, not what you think mattered. Everything. The words, the settings. Who else was in the room? What he was eating and drinking and whether he was relaxed or performing relaxed and exactly how he phrased the suggestion about last night. Because somewhere in the specific language he used is the thing I can take into that council room that doesn't need Marsh's documentation to stand up." Ethan stared at her. Something moved across his face, complicated, layered, the face of a man confronting several things simultaneously, including the specific face of having been used and the particular shame of not having seen it. "You're not walking away," he said. It wasn't a question. "No. They threatened to kill your investigator." "They put him in a hospital," she said. "If they wanted him dead, he'd be dead. He's leverage, which means they're still playing the long game, which means they're not ready to go fully open, which means I have a window." She looked at him directly. "I have less than 2 hours before that window closes. Talk to me." Something changed in his posture. She'd seen it happen before in other contexts. The moment Ethan Callahan stopped managing a conversation and actually entered it. It was physical, a slight drop in the shoulders, a change in the quality of his attention. He turned and walked toward the back of the house. She followed. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where they had eaten breakfast for the first 3 years of their marriage before Ethan started taking breakfast at the office, and the table became a surface for mail and files. He poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot that was old enough to be bitter and pushed one toward her without asking. He talked for 40 minutes. She listened the way she had trained herself to listen, which was without reaction, without reinforcement, without the conversational cues that made people feel heard, but also made them feel managed. She listened like a recording device. She wrote on a fresh page. Draper had reached out to Ethan in early July, 7 months ago, framing the initial contact as a response to some tensions in the Philadelphia corridor that he wanted Ethan's counsel on. 3 meetings over 2 months, all apparently about Philadelphia, all of which Ethan had treated as normal senior leadership consultation. The Sienna conversation had come in the 3rd meeting, casual, almost parenthetical, introduced as Draper sharing what he was hearing from his own soundings of the senior Dons. The phrasing, Ethan said, was, "There's a feeling that stability in the Callahan house would benefit from resolution. And the feeling I'm getting is that what resolution looks like might be different from what you think it needs to look like." He phrased it as the room's feeling, Victoria said, not his. "Yes." And the timing of the summit, the suggestion about making the declaration there. September. A second conversation I didn't think to. I didn't write it down. He said the winter summit was the right forum because it was controlled and because every major figure would be present and because a declaration there would be, his word, legitimizing. Legitimizing, she said. Yes. She wrote that. She circled it. In the September meeting, she said, who else was present? Just his second, a man named Arthur Webb. My detail was outside. Arthur Webb. She didn't know the name. She wrote it. And the venue, she said. When did Draper suggest the Meridian Grand? That was October, the venue committee meeting. He proposed it, and Caruso objected, and Draper made the case for it, and eventually Caruso agreed. Ethan's eyes moved, pulling up the memory. He said he had a preferred vendor relationship with the building management company, said it would streamline the security arrangements. The vendor relationship, the building management company, Arcline Facilities. He told you he had an existing relationship with the building's vendor, she said slowly. Yes. In front of the venue committee. Yes. Who was on that committee? Ethan listed 4 names. One of them was Gerald Price. One of them was a man from the Russo family's logistics arm. The other 2 were administrative figures from other families whose loyalty she couldn't immediately map. She set the pen down. She looked at the pages she had covered in the last 40 minutes, and she felt the specific sensation of a shape becoming visible, but not complete, not every line in place, but enough of the outline that she could see what it was. The vendor relationship statement was the key. Draper had said it in a committee meeting in front of witnesses. It linked him directly to Arcline. It was not the same as Marsh's financial documentation, but it was something that existed in other people's memories and could be independently corroborated. And it was something Draper would not have expected Ethan to remember clearly because it had been presented as mundane, administrative, the kind of detail that slides past even careful listeners. He hadn't counted on Ethan being interviewed by someone who cared about the exact words. She was reaching for her phone when the back door of the kitchen opened. She had not heard a key. She had not heard footsteps on the back step. And she had certainly not authorized anyone to have access to the Greystone service entrance, which meant either Ethan had not thought to tell her someone was coming, or Ethan had not known. Ethan's face told her instantly. He had not known. The man who came through the kitchen door was in his 50s, compact, wearing a dark jacket that was too light for January, carrying nothing visible. He stopped when he saw Victoria. His eyes moved to Ethan. Back to Victoria. Mrs. Callahan, he said. I wasn't told you'd be here. She didn't know him. She looked at Ethan. Ethan said very quietly, Marcus, what are you doing in my house? Marcus, last name unspoken, affiliation unspoken, settled his weight in the specific way of a man who has trained himself to always know where the exits are. Mr. Draper sends his regards, he said, and a message. His eyes moved to Victoria with the particular quality of an appraisal. He says the 2-hour window expired 20 minutes ago. Victoria looked at the clock on the kitchen wall. It was 3:17 in the morning. Her 2 hours had not expired. She had been given the ultimatum at 11:42. She had 2 hours from 11:42. That was 1:42 in the morning. It was now 3:17. The math was simple, and it was wrong on purpose, and she understood what that meant in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The 2-hour window had never been real. It had been the time they needed to get someone into this house. She looked at Ethan. He looked at her. And in the specific quality of that look, she saw something she had not expected to see. Not guilt, not calculation, but the raw expression of a man who had just understood, in the same moment she had, that he was standing in his own kitchen at 3 in the morning while a man walked through his back door, and that this was not separate from everything else that had happened, and that whoever had used him more completely than even she had realized, and that the thing she had built in her head about Draper and the investigation and the evidentiary chain was missing something, had been missing something from the start, something she had not looked at because she had been looking at everything else. Marcus, she said, keeping her voice at exactly the register of someone who is not afraid, which took everything she had. How did you get a key to this house? He didn't answer. She looked at Ethan. Who else has a key to the service entrance? Ethan's mouth opened. Gerald, he said. Gerald has a key. Gerald Price, who had called her tonight to warn her about the council meeting, who had called her to give her information that had moved her exactly where she needed to be moved. The thing she had missed. It wasn't Draper alone. It wasn't Hale alone. The operation had a relay, a trusted man inside the Callahan house who had been feeding information out and bringing information in, and who had tonight done both simultaneously, called her to place her at the council meeting, and then given Marcus the window to enter the Greystone while she and Ethan sat in the kitchen in the middle of the night with 7 pages of the most critical intelligence the investigation had produced. The pages were on the table between them. Marcus was between them and the door. And outside, in the cold January dark of East 71st Street, Marco, Russo's driver, the only person who knew where she was half a block away in a car, and he was 23 years old and had a scar through his eyebrow, and Victoria did not know, in this moment, whether the message that just arrived through that back door was the worst thing that had happened tonight or the opening move of something considerably worse. She moved before Marcus finished his second breath after speaking. Not toward the door, not toward Marcus, toward the table. She grabbed the 7 pages of legal pad, folded them once across the middle with a single motion, and pushed them into the inside pocket of Russo's oversized coat in one continuous movement that took less than 2 seconds, and that Marcus was half a step too slow to interrupt because he had been watching her face and not her hands, which was the mistake people made with Victoria. Always the same mistake. They watched her face because her face was controlled, and her hands were where she actually lived. Marcus stepped forward. Put those down. They're already down, she said. I put them in my pocket, which is also down, relatively speaking. Ethan moved, not toward Marcus either, sideways to the kitchen island, putting the granite counter between himself and the man who had come through his back door. His eyes were on Marcus, and they had the specific quality of a man who is angry enough that the anger has gone past the shaking stage into something colder and more useful. You're in my house, Ethan said. His voice was low. In my kitchen. At 3 a.m, through my back door. Mr. Draper doesn't have a key to my house, Ethan said. Gerald Price has a key to my house. Where is Gerald? Marcus said nothing. Ethan's jaw worked once. Where is Gerald? He's comfortable, Marcus said. He'll stay that way depending on how the next few minutes go. Victoria was watching Marcus's hands. His jacket was unstructured, no visible print from a shoulder holster, but the right side hung slightly different from the left, which meant hip carry. Right side, which meant his draw was across his body if he was standing at his current angle to her, which bought approximately a half second of additional time over a conventional draw if she needed it, and she needed to know that. She also needed to not need it. What does Draper want right now, tonight, from this house? She said. Her voice was the same register it had been, controlled even, the voice she used when her father had drilled her as a child on negotiating from an inferior position. You never let them hear the calculation. You let them hear certainty, even when certainty is the thing you have the least of. Marcus looked at her. He wants what's on those pages. There's nothing on these pages that isn't in my head, she said. You can take the paper. You can't take the memory. Mrs. Callahan. His voice had the specific patience of a man who has done this before and found patience more effective than volume. We're not here to hurt anyone. We're here to make clear that the investigation needs to change direction. Draper is prepared to make that worthwhile for the appropriate parties. He wants to buy me off, she said. He wants to reach an arrangement. While his man stands in my husband's kitchen at 3 a.m, she let a beat pass. That's an interesting negotiating posture? Something moved in Marcus's expression. Not quite uncertainty, but the adjacent quality, the slight recalibration of a man who had come into a situation with a script and is finding the other party is not reading from it. She used that half second. Ethan, she said, not looking away from Marcus. Your phone, call Marco, right now. Who? The driver outside, Russo's man. Call him. Tell him to call Russo directly, and tell him there's a visitor at the Greystone who came through the service entrance. Marcus took one step forward. I wouldn't... You would what? Ethan said. His voice had changed. The cold anger had settled into something operational. The voice Victoria had heard him use exactly twice in 11 years, when situations moved past the point of management. He had his phone in his hand. He was dialing. You came into my house. You came into my house uninvited through my back door, and you're threatening my... He stopped, recalibrated. You threatened Gerald, who has worked for this family since before I had the house. You tell Draper... Ethan, Victoria's voice sharp. He stopped. Make the call, she said. One sentence, then stop talking. He made the call. She heard Marco answer, heard Ethan give him the sentence. Visitor, service entrance, call Russo. And then he lowered the phone. Marcus stood very still. He was recalculating. She could see it happening. The reassessment of a man who had arrived expecting a woman alone and possibly frightened and had found something else entirely. The pages, he said again, but the certainty was slightly thinner now. No, she said. They stood in the kitchen of the Greystone Brownstone at 3:20 in the morning, the three of them in the particular standoff that has no clean name. Not quite a confrontation, not quite a negotiation, something in between, balanced on the specific question of who was willing to escalate first and how far. Marcus made his decision. She saw it happen in his shoulders before it reached his face. The slight settling that meant he had decided not to push, which meant either his instructions had limits she hadn't expected, or the arrival of Russo's name in the calculation had changed his math. Tell Mrs. Callahan, he said, and it was interesting that he addressed Ethan now instead of her, interesting in the way that revealed something about how Marcus understood the room, that Mr. Draper will be in contact through appropriate channels tomorrow, and that the offer of an arrangement remains open. He went back out the door he'd come in through. They heard the step, then nothing. No retreating footsteps, just absence, which was its own kind of information about how Marcus moved when he wanted to. Ethan turned to look at her. He had a specific expression she hadn't seen from him in years, the one that meant he had been badly surprised and was managing the aftermath of it. Gerald, he said. I know. I know, Ethan. For how long? I don't know yet. She was already moving toward the front of the house, toward the window that looked out onto East 71st. She could see Marco's car, half a block down, still there, the exhaust running white in the cold. But it's long enough that everything Gerald knew, Draper knew, and Gerald knew the investigation. Gerald knew the council meeting. Gerald knew you and I were here tonight. He called you, Ethan said. He'd followed her to the front room. His voice had a specific quality, hollow-centered, like something had been removed from it. He called you to tell you about the meeting. He put me in position, she said. He knew the meeting was happening because he helped orchestrate the invitation. He called me to make sure I went because they needed me visible and officially responsible before the shooting happened. She watched Marco's car. And then he let Marcus in through the back while we sat in the kitchen. Ethan sat down on the arm of the nearest chair. It was an uncharacteristic thing for him to do. Ethan didn't perch. Ethan occupied. And the smallness of it said more about where he was than anything on his face. I recruited him, Ethan said. Gerald. I recruited him myself, 1998. He was 26 years old and he stopped. I vouched for him to my father. She said nothing. There was nothing to say to that. Her phone rang. Russo. She answered. Marco told me, Russo said. No preamble. Are you intact? Yes. Marcus, I don't have a last name, came through the service entrance. He's gone now. Gerald Price gave him access. A sound on Russo's end that she couldn't fully categorize, somewhere between a breath and something that had no name. Gerald. It goes back at least 8 months based on what Marsh found, possibly longer. She turned away from the window. Carmine, I need something from you right now, tonight. Can you get to Marsh? His location, his condition? And if there are physical copies of his documentation somewhere, they need to be. Already moving, Russo said. I had 2 men on him after you called me earlier. They found the vehicle. He's concussed, 2 cracked ribs, but he's talking. He told my men the copies are in a storage unit on the west side. He gave them the address and the code. She closed her eyes for 1 second, opened them. Get the copies. Put them somewhere with 3 separate people who can verify their existence independently. Done by morning. A pause. Victoria, Draper is going to move tomorrow. He can't afford to wait now that Marcus has been made. Whatever he's planning to do through official channels, through the council, through the review motion, he's going to accelerate it. I know. Can you be ready? She looked at the 7 pages folded inside the borrowed coat. She looked at Ethan sitting on the arm of the chair in his own living room looking like a man taking inventory of everything he'd trusted and finding the math wrong. By morning, she said. Yes. She ended the call and turned to Ethan fully. Get up, she said. I need 2 more hours of your memory, and then I need you to sleep. Because tomorrow you're going to have to walk into a room full of men who watched you kiss another woman over a microphone and leave me in a burning building, and you're going to have to do it with your back straight, and that requires you to have slept. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face moved, complicated, resistant, and then not. He got up. They sat back down at the kitchen table. The coffee was cold. She didn't touch it. He poured it out and made a fresh pot without being asked, which was something she recorded somewhere below the level of conscious thought, a small domestic fact in the middle of everything. They worked until 5:15. At 5:30, she left the Greystone. Marco drove her back to the hotel. She slept for 90 minutes on top of the covers, fully dressed, with the 7 pages under her right hand, and woke at 7:10 with the particular clarity of someone who has slept very little and processed very much and has landed on the other side of it into a specific and useful state of cold. She showered. She borrowed clothes from a car Russo had arranged. A woman from his household staff had dropped a bag at the hotel's service entrance at 6:30, containing practical things: dark trousers, a charcoal blouse, flat shoes that fit, a blazer that was close enough. She put on her mother's pearls, which had survived 2 nights in a row of things that should have destroyed them. She ate a full breakfast from room service. She had not eaten since before the Meridian Grand, and her body had been running on cortisol and coffee for 36 hours, and she was not going to walk into the most important meeting of her life on an empty stomach. At 8:45, Russo called to tell her Draper had formally requested an emergency session of the full Alliance Council to be held at 11 that morning, at which he intended to present evidence of misconduct in the handling of the Meridian Grand investigation. Evidence of misconduct. Her misconduct. She ate the last of her eggs. She drank her coffee. Where? She asked. The Lexington room again. He's using his right as a senior Don to call a full session. He has the right, she said. He does. Then we go. She set down her cup. Carmine, the documentation from Marsh's storage unit, I need it at the Lexington building before 11. Not copies. Originals. I'll have it there by 10. And I need a room to work in for the 2 hours before the session. Somewhere in the building, private, with a table. Done. One more thing, she paused. Invite Ethan. The pause on Russo's end was precisely calibrated. To the prep session. To the council meeting, formally. Make sure the invitation goes to him through official channels, documented, before 9 this morning. Whatever Draper has planned for that room, he's planned it around a specific configuration of people and a specific balance of power. Ethan walking through that door, voluntary, unbroken, in front of every Don, is not part of Draper's script. Russo said slowly, You're using him. I'm giving him the chance to be present for his own reckoning, she said. That's different. She wasn't entirely sure that was different. She thought it was close enough. The 2 hours before the session were the most concentrated work she had ever done in a room. Marsh's documentation arrived in a sealed envelope at 9:15, carried by one of Russo's men who waited outside the door, while she and Russo and a lawyer the Alliance used for exactly this kind of undocumentable work went through every page. The financial transfers, the cell tower records, the contractor chain, the burner phone text exchange referencing the platform event, and the new material, the thing that hadn't been in her 7 pages the night before. A second set of records Marsh had apparently compiled and sealed in the storage unit specifically because he hadn't trusted even her with it yet. Records that placed Gerald Price in a direct communication chain with an Arthur Webb, Draper's second, through a relay of messages that had been routed through the Meridian Group's administrative server. the same PR firm that employed Sienna Voss. She stopped when she got to that page. He used the firm, she said. Russo looked. Price's messages went through the same server that processed Sienna's employment communications. Which means, she set the page down. Sienna's clearance, the background check that Hale signed off on, the referral from Draper that put her in Ethan's orbit. She looked at the page. Price was the relay point. He didn't just give Marcus a key, he built the channel. He's the connective tissue between every piece of this. The lawyer, a thin man named Geary who hadn't introduced himself with a first name, looked up from the financial records. This is enough, he said. He was not a man who used words carelessly. Not for a federal court, but for the purposes of this council. This is enough. She checked the time. 10:41. Is Ethan here? She asked Russo. He arrived at 10:30. He's in the lobby. She nodded once. She gathered the documentation, organized it into sequence, clipped it, put it in a folder. She stood up, straightened the blazer, touched the pearls once at her throat, not from nerves, from habit, and walked to the door. The Lexington room was fuller than the night before. Every family above the threshold had sent representation, and most had sent their principal. She counted 26 people as she entered. The table had been expanded. Draper sat at the far end, which was either a power position or the isolation of a man who needed distance, and she wasn't sure yet which it was. She saw him clearly for the first time in the context of all of this. Thomas Draper. 58, silver-haired, the gift-bearing moderate, the remembered children man. He was watching her enter with the particular expression of someone who has prepared extensively and is finding that what's walking through the door is not quite what they prepared for. She sat in the same chair she had occupied the night before, the center of the table. She set the folder in front of her, closed. Ethan came in 30 seconds after her. He sat 3 chairs to her right. He didn't look at Draper. He looked forward. Pelletier opened the session. Draper had the floor first. He spoke for 11 minutes. He was good. She had to give him that. He had constructed the narrative with precision, the sequence of events reframed to center her as the destabilizing factor, the unauthorized involvement in the investigation, the failure to protect the 2 men who had been shot on her watch, the suggestion that her motive in inserting herself was not the alliance's interests, but the preservation of her own position within a marriage that was publicly dissolving. He was careful not to make accusations he couldn't support. He kept his language conditional. It would appear, it raises questions, the timing suggests. He built inference without overextending. Several people around the table were nodding, not all of them, but several. When he finished, Pelletier looked at her. Mrs. Callahan. She opened the folder. She spoke for 22 minutes. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform indignation. She laid it out the way her father had taught her to lay out an argument, not by appealing to the room's feelings, but by making the facts so sequential and so specific that feeling became irrelevant. The contractor chain, the Delaware LLC, the financial transfers to Curtis Hale, the burner phone, the Meridian Group server, Gerald Price's message relay, the cell tower record placing Price's device in the building on the night of the summit in the service corridor 43 minutes before the charge detonated. She placed the originals from Marsh's storage unit in front of Geary, who distributed copies to each attendee. She watched the room read. She watched Draper's face while the room read. He was still. He was very still. His hands were flat on the table, and his expression had the quality of a man who had placed a bet based on a calculation and was watching the calculation prove wrong in real time, page by page, in a room full of the people whose opinion of him was the thing he had built his entire life around. On the night of the summit, she said, when the room had finished reading, Thomas Draper arranged for Gerald Price, a man who had served the Callahan family for 16 years, to relay the operational schedule for the Meridian Grand's 14th floor to the contractor firm that placed the charge. The objective was not to kill anyone in this room. The objective was to create a crisis at the precise moment that Ethan Callahan had been maneuvered, through 7 months of careful preparation, into making a public and highly visible personal choice that would define how every person in this room saw him under pressure. She paused. It worked. Ethan made the choice they wanted him to make, And when the building came down, they needed someone to step into the chaos who could then be made to look complicit in what followed. So they arranged for me to be invited into that role, positioned me as coordinator, and then used Price's access to move on 2 Alliance members before I had any operational ability to prevent it. The room was completely silent. The 2 men who were shot last night, she continued, were shot by people working for Thomas Draper. The motive was not competition. The motive was to create a visible failure on my record within 48 hours of my appointment, so that this morning's session could be framed as an accountability measure rather than what it actually is. She looked directly at Draper. "A play for the chair." Draper said, "This is documented," she said. "Every claim I have made in the last 22 minutes is supported by the papers in front of you. The financial records are original. The phone records are original. The message relay through the Meridian Group server is documented by a former Alliance intelligence analyst whose integrity can be independently verified and who is currently recovering from a car accident that was not an accident." She closed her folder. "I'm not asking this council to take my word," she said. "I'm asking them to read what's in front of them." The silence lasted long enough that she could hear the ventilation in the ceiling. Then Don DiStefano, blunt, Boston, the man who said what the room was thinking, looked across the table at Thomas Draper and said, "Tom, you want to say something." Draper looked at the papers. He looked at the room. He looked at the specific faces of the men who had 10 minutes ago been nodding along with his narrative and were now holding originals of documents that placed his name on a chain of events that had put 2 Alliance members in the hospital and blown out the south wall of the Meridian Grand. He looked at Victoria. For the first time in everything she had observed of Thomas Draper, she saw something on his face that was not managed. It was brief, less than 2 seconds, but it was there, and what it was the expression of a man who has built something enormous and specific over a long period of time and has just watched it become untenable in a single morning. "I'd like to speak with my counsel," he said. "Your counsel," Pelletier said with a precision that carried everything, "is not in this room. The ventilation, the papers, 26 people reading and recalculating." Draper said nothing else. Victoria sat with her hands flat on the table and her spine straight and the pearls at her throat, and she breathed, slow and even, and she did not look at Ethan, did not look at Russo, did not look at anyone, because this was the moment that required absolute stillness, the moment where anything she did with her body or her face would become the image the room carried away. And the image she needed them to carry was not relief, not triumph, not the specific satisfaction that was moving through her chest like a current she was holding in with everything she had. She needed them to see what she had always been: controlled, precise, present. Pelletier spoke. "We will recess for 30 minutes. When we return, this council will address the question of Thomas Draper's standing, and subsequently the question of interim leadership for Don Pelletier." The voice was Ethan's. Quiet. Everyone turned. He was sitting straight, 3 chairs to Victoria's right, looking at the head of the table with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not the anger, not the performance of authority, something stripped of all that, something that was very nearly the face of a man of 53, seeing something clearly for the first time. "Before we recess," he paused, "I want to formally acknowledge, in front of this council, that my wife prevented casualties that night when I did not, and that every correct decision made in the response to that bombing was made by her." He paused again. "That should be on the record." The room was silent. She looked at him then. She couldn't help it. Across 3 empty chairs, she looked at Ethan Callahan, who had kissed another woman on a stage and left her in smoke and debris, and had spent 8 months being slowly manipulated into destroying his own legacy. And something passed between them that had no name and was not reconciliation and was not forgiveness, and was simply the specific acknowledgement of 2 people who had been, whatever else, in this together for 11 years. She looked away. Pelletier said, "So noted. We recess." The room began to move. Chairs pulled back, voices starting low, the controlled chaos of 26 powerful people processing the last 40 minutes simultaneously. Victoria stayed in her seat. She put both palms flat on the table and she let herself feel the full weight of the last 48 hours in her legs and her back and the left side where the glass had grazed her, and she breathed and she stayed very still. Russo appeared at her shoulder. He didn't sit. He just stood there for a moment, which was its own kind of thing. "The motion on Draper will pass," he said quietly. "Unanimous or close to it." "And the interim leadership motion." He was quiet for a moment. "Pelletier is going to propose something. He discussed it with me this morning. I want you to hear it from him." A pause. "But Victoria, be ready." She looked up at him. He had blood still on his shirt cuff from 2 nights ago, she realized. Different shirt, different cuff, same man. He hadn't mentioned it then, and he didn't mention it now. "What does it mean?" she asked. "Be ready." "It means," Russo said carefully, "that what happens in this room when we come back from recess is going to be something this alliance has not done before. And the man who comes through a door changes based on who is waiting behind it." She understood what he was saying. She understood it completely, and the understanding moved through her like cold water. Not unpleasant, but clarifying, the specific sensation of a reality becoming undeniable. She had walked into this building as a coordinator with no official standing and documentation that might or might not be enough, and a husband 3 chairs to her right who could have been an enemy and had turned out to be something more complicated than that. She was going to walk back into this room in 30 minutes as something that didn't have a name yet. She sat with that. Outside in the corridor, she could hear the voices, the specific sound of men whose certainties had just been rearranged, debating the shape of what came next. And through the room's single window, the January light was flat and cold and white. And somewhere across the city, Daniel Marsh was in a hospital bed with 2 cracked ribs and a storage unit that had just changed everything. And Sienna Voss was in her apartment with no protection detail and no knowledge of the war she'd been a piece of. And Gerald Price was wherever Marcus had left him. And Thomas Draper was sitting 15 feet away with his hands on a table and no more moves. And Ethan Callahan was in a corridor she couldn't see, standing in the middle of everything he'd lost. And 30 minutes from now, Pelletier was going to stand up in this room and say something that would divide every conversation she had for the rest of her life into before and after. The ventilation hummed. She put her hands flat on the table and she waited. And she was still, and she was ready. Pelletier came back into the room first. That was how Victoria knew the recess had been more than a recess. When the senior Don of the Montreal operation, a man who had been in this business for 40 years and who moved through rooms with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who had never needed to rush, came back through the door 2 minutes ahead of everyone else, and took his seat and folded his hands on the table and looked at no one. It meant the 30 minutes had been a conversation, and the conversation had already reached a conclusion, and what was about to happen in this room had been decided in a corridor. The others filed back in. Draper came in near the end, alone. She noticed he had separated from the 2 men who had flanked him before the recess, which meant either they had been pulled away from him or he had sent them away, and neither option suggested strength. He sat. He did not look at the documentation still in front of his chair. He looked at the middle distance of the table's surface with the expression of a man who has accepted something and has not yet found the shape of how to carry it. Ethan came in last. He sat in the same chair as before, 3 to her right, and this time he did look at her, briefly, a look with no performance in it, just information passing between 2 people who had spent the last 18 hours in the same wreckage. She gave him a single nod. He looked away. Pelletier waited until the room was fully settled. Then he said, "Before we address the motion regarding Thomas Draper's standing, I want to read something into this session's record." He unfolded a single piece of paper. He put on reading glasses that made him look briefly like someone's grandfather. At 7:45 this morning, in a conversation attended by Carmine Russo, Don Frank Caruso, and myself, a preliminary review of the documentation presented by Victoria Callahan was conducted. We invited independent verification from 3 administrative figures within the Alliance's internal record structure. All 3 confirmed the authenticity of the financial transfer records and the contractor chain documentation. He removed the glasses. This was not procedurally standard. It was necessary. The room received that. We also received, at 9:03 this morning, a signed statement from Daniel Marsh, currently recovering at Lenox Hill, corroborating the entirety of the evidentiary chain and attesting to the circumstances of last evening's vehicular incident. Pelletier set the paper down. The statement has been distributed to everyone in this room in the last 10 minutes. I presume you've had time to review it. Nods around the table. not from Draper. Pelletier looked at Draper. Thomas. Draper looked up. He was composed. She would give him that. He had constructed himself into a particular shape over a long life, and the shape held even now, when the thing inside it had been evacuated. "I'm not going to insult this room with a denial," he said. His voice was even, unremarkable. "What I will say is that my objectives were not to harm the Alliance. They were to correct what I believed was a structural problem in its leadership." DeStefano said, "By blowing up the building we were all sitting in. The charge was designed to—" "2 of my men are in the hospital, Tom." Draper stopped. "2 men who have families," DeStefano said. His voice hadn't risen. It had done the opposite. "Who trusted that when they walked into an Alliance summit, they were walking into something that was being protected. You want to talk to me about structural problems, fine. But you do it after you explain to me how putting Arcline's people in a building with my men in it, after telling us yourself that you had a preferred vendor relationship with that building, which is something I remember you saying in October, which is now something I understand differently, how that is anything other than a betrayal." The room let that sit. Draper said nothing. Pelletier said, "The motion before this council is the formal removal of the Draper family from the Winter Alliance pending a full investigation by a panel of 3 senior Dons with findings to be presented no later than 60 days from today. The motion requires a 2/3 majority. The vote took 4 minutes. It was not unanimous. 3 abstentions, 2 from families whose ties to the Philadelphia corridor made the politics complicated, 1 from a Don who voted against nothing on principle and whose abstention was therefore meaningless. Every other vote was in favor. Draper received the result without visible reaction. He stood when it was announced. He buttoned his jacket. He looked at Pelletier and gave a formal nod that was, Victoria thought, the most genuinely composed thing she had watched him do in the entire morning. The nod of a man who understood that the form of things mattered even when the substance had collapsed. He did not look at her. She had expected him to. She had prepared herself for it, for whatever he would put in that look, whether it was fury or contempt, or the specific coldness of a man who has lost and intends to revisit it. But he walked to the door and through it, and she was left with the absence of his attention, which was its own kind of thing. 3 men followed him out. 2 stayed. That told her something about the internal fissures in the Draper family that would become relevant in the next 60 days. The room reorganized itself after a minute. Chairs shifting, 2 quiet conversations starting in the corners, the particular exhale of a collected body that has just completed a difficult thing. Pelletier did not exhale. He looked at his folded hands, and then he looked up and he said, "The second matter." The room went quiet again. "Interim leadership of the Callahan family's alliance obligations." He paused. "And the question of investigation oversight." She waited. "This council has spent the last 30 minutes discussing a proposal that is, as I said before we recessed, without precedent." He was looking at her directly now. "Mrs. Callahan, I want to ask you directly, in front of this room. In the 48 hours since the Meridian Grand, you have operated without official standing, without title, and under significant personal and physical pressure. The result is what you see in front of you." A pause. "What I want to know, what we need to know, is whether what we have seen is circumstantial, whether it is the product of a specific crisis that brought out specific capacities, or whether it represents something that can be sustained." She could feel the room on her like a physical thing. 23 people and the specific weight of their collective attention, which was different from an audience and different from a crowd. This was the attention of people who made permanent decisions about other people's lives and who understood the gravity of what they were looking at. She did not reach for the folder. She did not look at her notes. She looked at Pelletier. "I spent 11 years in rooms adjacent to this one," she said. "Not in them. Knowing the names, the families, the pressure points, the histories, knowing all of it and being asked to do nothing with it except make sure the right people sat next to each other at dinner." She paused, not for effect, but because the next part required precision. "What I did in the last 48 hours is not separate from those 11 years. It is those 11 years. The difference is that 48 hours ago, the crisis made it visible." The room was very still. Can it be sustained? She said, not repeating it as a question, but as an acknowledgement that the question was fair. I don't know what sustained looks like in a role that didn't exist yesterday, but I know what the Alliance needs right now, which is not another ambitious man with an agenda. It needs someone whose only agenda is the Alliance's stability because she has nothing else to protect. Another pause. I have no family to advance, no territory to expand, no old scores. She looked at the table's surface for a moment, then back at Pelletier. What I have is the clearest possible understanding of what happens when personal interest is allowed to run through the center of something that belongs to everyone. She didn't say Ethan's name. She didn't say Draper's. She didn't need to. The silence lasted 8 seconds. She counted them the way she had counted the 60 seconds in the car the night before. Then DeStefano, Blunt, Boston, the man who said what the room was thinking, said, I vote yes. He wasn't supposed to vote yet. There hadn't been a formal motion. Pelletier looked at him with the expression of a man who has given up trying to run a meeting by Robert's rules when DeStefano was in the room. The motion, Pelletier said, with a slight correction in his voice, is to appoint Victoria Callahan as Supreme Coordinator of the Winter Alliance, a newly created position with oversight of interfamily disputes, security coordination, and investigation authority, on a provisional basis pending a full review at the Spring Summit. He looked at the room. All in favor. It was not 4 minutes this time. It was less than 2. It was not unanimous. 4 against the 2 families with Philadelphia ties who had abstained on Draper, and 2 others whose reasons she would need to understand and address in the weeks ahead. 4 against and 19 in favor. And when Pelletier said, the motion carries, the sound the room made was not applause, was not celebration. It was the specific sound of a collective exhale from people who had been holding something heavy and had just been allowed to set it down. She sat with her hands flat on the table for a moment after the vote. Then she picked up her pen, opened the folder to a blank page, and wrote the date at the top. January, the year, the Lexington room. She wrote the names of the 4 who had voted against, not in anger, as information. These were the first 4 relationships she needed to rebuild. Carmine Russo, beside her, watched her write and said nothing. The meeting dissolved in stages. People came to her individually, not all of them, not the 4, but the others, one by one, with the handshakes and the specific careful words of men who were recalibrating their understanding of a situation. Don Pelletier last of all, who shook her hand with both of his and held it for a moment longer than a handshake required, and said very quietly, Your father would have been a complicated kind of proud. She had not expected that. She did not fully succeed at keeping her face neutral. You knew my father, she said, briefly, a long time ago. He released her hand. He talked about you. She did not ask what he had said. She wasn't sure she could afford to know. Ethan was gone by the time the room had fully cleared. She found him in the corridor outside, not leaving, just standing, coat on, hands in his pockets, looking at the wall opposite with the expression of a man waiting for something without knowing what he's waiting for. She stopped beside him. They stood for a moment in the corridor's fluorescent quiet. You should have a lawyer, she said. Not Gerald's lawyer, someone independent. Call Martin Feige if you haven't already. He knows the Alliance's structure well enough to advise you without a learning curve. Victoria. The council review of Callahan's standing is still coming. Draper's removal doesn't cancel it. They'll want to address what happened at the summit formally, and you need someone advising you who... Victoria! His voice was not sharp. It was the opposite. It was the voice of a man asking to be heard rather than managed. She stopped. He looked at the wall for another moment. Then he turned to look at her. The corridor light was flat and ungenerous, and in it, Ethan looked his age in a way that the careful lighting of the ivory room had never allowed. The lines around his eyes, the gray that was more than silver now, the jaw that was still a quarry shelf but had something tired around it. Was any of it real? He said. The 11 years. She understood what he was asking. She had been expecting the question and had been prepared for it, had constructed an answer that was truthful and boundaried and did not open anything that needed to stay closed. She found, standing in the corridor, that she didn't want to give him the prepared answer. Yes, she said, parts of it. Not the last 3 years, but before that? Yes. He nodded. A small, slow nod. The kind that isn't agreement, but is acknowledgement. The kind that says, I thought so, and it doesn't help much, and I'm going to have to carry it anyway. Sienna didn't know, she said. I want you to know that. She wasn't part of it. She was placed. Price managed the introduction through the firm, through Hale's vetting. But she was a piece they moved, not a player. Something in his face moved. She couldn't fully name it. Not relief, not guilt. Something between them. Where is she? He said. At her apartment, as far as I know. She should probably leave New York for a while. Somewhere Draper's remaining people can't reach her while the family investigation is open. She paused. That's my advice. What you do with it is your decision. He looked at her for a moment. Are you always going to talk to me like this now? Like what? Like I'm a problem you're managing. She looked back at him. I don't know yet, she said. I'm not sure what we are to each other now. I'm not sure there's language for it yet. He accepted that. He was, she thought, better at accepting things than he had been 48 hours ago. Not in a diminished way, but in the way of a man who has had several of his fundamental assumptions removed and has discovered that he is still standing, which can, in some people, produce a specific and durable kind of clarity. He left. She watched him walk to the elevator. He didn't look back. She did not feel what she had expected to feel, which was relief or release, or the specific lightness of a thing completed. She felt the weight of the folders under her arm and the dull ache in her left side and the particular exhaustion of a human body that has been asked to operate at maximum capacity for 2 days and is now presenting the bill. She also felt, somewhere below all of that, the quiet and specific presence of something she had not allowed herself to name while she needed it to stay functional, because naming things made them real, and real things could be targeted. But the meeting was over, and Draper was gone, and Ethan had walked to the elevator, and she was standing in a corridor by herself with a title that had not existed yesterday morning, so she let herself name it. She was not going to pretend it was simple. She was not going to call it victory, because victory implied a defined enemy and a clear endpoint, and what she had instead was a very long project and 4 people who had voted against her and a Draper family investigation that would be complicated and a Callahan operation in transition that needed careful management and Daniel Marsh in a hospital with cracked ribs and a storage unit full of documents that were now her responsibility. She was going to call it the beginning of a thing that was entirely hers. That was enough. For this corridor, for this moment, that was enough. She took the elevator down alone. In the weeks that followed, the shape of the new thing became visible in increments, the way landscapes become visible through early morning fog. Not all at once, but piece by piece, each piece clarifying the next. The Draper investigation moved faster than the 60-day timeline because Victoria pushed it, and because 3 members of the Draper family's own inner circle, reading the documentation and understanding which direction the wind had permanently shifted, cooperated. Thomas Draper was formally removed from all alliance standing at a closed session in late February. He did not contest it. He retained his legitimate business interests, the real estate holdings, the Delaware LLCs that hadn't been directly implicated, and he retired to a property in South Carolina whose address Victoria's office noted and filed. He was 60 years old. He had gambled everything on a single operation that had required 9 months of preparation and a perfect alignment of circumstances, and the alignment had been close enough to perfect that, on a different night, with a different woman standing near the east side of the ivory room, it might have worked. It had not worked. Gerald Price was handled privately. Victoria made that decision herself, after long consideration, and she was aware that it was not the decision everyone around her would have made. Price was 52 and had been serving the Callahan operation since he was 26, and had apparently been approached by Draper's people in the summer of the previous year through a financial pressure point, a debt, specific and substantial, accumulated by a family member, that had been identified through surveillance and then leveraged. He had not volunteered. He had been found and used, the same way Sienna had been found and used, the same way Ethan's specific vanities had been found and used, and Pelletier's administrative server, and the Meridian Group's communications infrastructure. Draper had been a comprehensive and patient architect. Victoria met with Price once, in a neutral location, without witnesses. She did not tell anyone what was said in that meeting. What she did say to Russo afterward was that Price would be relocating and would not be in contact with any Alliance-adjacent operation going forward. Russo had looked at her for a long moment and then said, "All right," in the voice of a man who understood that the new Supreme Coordinator had made a call and was not going to explain it further. The debt that had been used to turn him, she had it cleared, anonymously, through a channel that couldn't be traced back to her. She did this not because Price had earned it, but because the debt had been the instrument of his compromise, and the instrument should not outlive the situation that had produced it. That was her logic. She was not entirely sure the logic was sound. She thought about it, at odd moments in the weeks that followed, the way you think about decisions that don't have a clean answer, not with regret, but with the open attention of someone who is still learning the terrain of what they've become. Curtis Hale's situation was cleaner. His financial relationship with the Draper operation was documented and irrefutable, and he had known what he was doing at every step without the compulsion of leveraged debt. He was removed from the Callahan operation and from Alliance access. The specifics of what happened after that were handled by people whose job those specifics were. Sienna Voss left New York in late January. Victoria did not arrange it, but she did not prevent it either. She had, through a channel that had no direct line back to her, ensured that Sienna's relocation costs were covered and that her employment records at the Meridian Group were sealed. Sienna had not asked for this. She didn't know it had happened. Some things, Victoria had decided, you do for people not because they ask, but because you were in the room when they were used, and you were in a position to make it slightly less costly, and you chose to. Marsh came out of the hospital after 5 days. He came to the Park Avenue office, the Callahan family's administrative center, which was now something different in function, if not yet in name, with his 2 cracked ribs taped and his left arm in a brace, and the specific expression of a man who has had several days of hospital time to think about his choices and has made his peace with them. Victoria offered him the position of Director of Internal Security for the Winter Alliance. It was a new title, same as hers. The Alliance was, in many ways, inventing itself around the new structure as the new structure came into being. He accepted without asking about compensation. She told him anyway, because she was not Ethan, and she was not going to run an operation where the people who risked their lives for her did so on the assumption that loyalty would be recognized without specification. The Callahan family review happened in early March. It was, as reviews of this kind went, formal and measured, and arrived at its conclusions with the particular efficiency of a proceeding where the facts are not genuinely in dispute. Ethan appeared before the council. He did not bring the lawyer she had recommended. He brought Feige and another counsel she didn't know, which suggested he had taken her advice about the original recommendation and was now making his own decisions about execution, which was probably healthy. He testified for 90 minutes. He was, by all accounts she received afterward, honest. Not strategically honest, actually honest, which was rarer and harder, and in his case had the additional quality of being directed at himself in a way that she suspected cost him considerably. The council's finding acknowledged his failure to protect Alliance members during the Meridian Grand Crisis, and formally noted his response during the subsequent investigation as a mitigating factor. His standing within the Alliance was reduced from senior voting member to associate standing, which meant he retained his operational independence but lost his seat at the formal table. He called her the evening after the finding was announced. She was in the Park Avenue office at 10:30 at night, working through the documentation for a separate interfamily dispute that had been waiting for resolution since November, and that the previous coordination structure had allowed to fester. "It's done," he said. "I heard," she said. "Are you at the office?" "Yes." A pause. "You need to sleep." "I know." Another pause. Longer. "The Greystone's available," he said. "If you need a base in the city that isn't a hotel, I'm not using it." She looked at the documents in front of her. She looked at the window, at the city outside in the March dark. "I have an apartment," she said. "I'll use that." "Right." A beat. "Victoria, the thing you said in the corridor, about not knowing what language there was for what we are now." She waited. I think we're people who are in something hard together, he said. And now we're on the other side of it. I don't know what that is exactly either, but I don't think it needs a name to be real. She sat with that for a moment. It was the most careful thing she had heard Ethan Callahan say in 11 years of listening to him. She thought he had probably been practicing it. She thought it was possibly the better version of who he could have been. No, she said, I don't think it does. She ended the call and sat in the quiet of the office for a few minutes, doing nothing, which was something she had allowed herself very rarely in the last 8 weeks, and was learning, slowly, to allow more. Then she picked up the pen and went back to work. The rebuilt Winter Gala was held in April, not in January. The decision to move it from its traditional date was partly logistical and partly deliberate, a signal that the alliance was not simply resuming as before, but had made a considered choice to mark the distance between the Meridian Grand and whatever came next. The venue was a different building, a property on Park Avenue that the alliance used for its legitimate charitable functions. A room with no history of anything other than fundraisers and award dinners and the kind of politely glamorous events that existed as cover for what the organization actually was. Victoria arrived without announcement. She was wearing the same midnight blue she had worn to the Meridian Grand. Not the same dress, it was beyond reconstruction, but the same color, deliberate, chosen from her closet on the morning of the gala with the specific intention of wearing the color rather than avoiding it. The pearls were at her throat. Her hair was down, which was unusual enough in professional contexts that 2 people remarked on it, and she did not explain it because it needed no explanation. She had worn it down because she wanted to. The room was full. Not as formally configured as the January summit. The April gala was lighter in structure, a reception format rather than a seated dinner, which allowed movement and conversation and the kind of relationship building that the alliance's formal sessions didn't accommodate. She moved through it the way she had learned to move through rooms in 11 years of invisible observation, except that the room now moved around her instead of past her, which was a physical difference that took some adjustment. Pelletier found her near the east side of the room. He had a glass of water. She had noticed he never drank at events, which was another small data point in the extensive catalog she maintained of the people she needed to understand. "How are the 4?" he said. He meant the 4 who had voted against her in January. "2 are moving," she said. "The Philadelphia adjacency is a relationship issue, not a principal issue. I'll have it resolved before summer." She paused. "The other 2 need more time. That's acceptable." He nodded. "And the Draper family's secondary structure. Complicated. Webb, Arthur Webb, Draper's second, is managing the transition in a direction I think we can work with. I have a meeting scheduled in 2 weeks. She looked at her glass. "He's not Draper. He's more careful and less ambitious, which is probably what the Philadelphia corridor needs right now." "You're not concerned he'll rebuild?" "I'm concerned about everything," she said. "That's the job." She looked at him. "Being concerned about everything is different from being afraid of it." He smiled. A small, precise smile, the kind she'd never seen from him before. "Your father really would have been complicated about you," he said. She let herself smile back. "I know." He moved on. She remained for a moment near the east wall. The east wall where the windows of the ivory room had blown inward 3 months ago, where she had stood holding a champagne glass while her husband kissed another woman into a microphone, where the floor had shuddered and the ceiling had come down and she had not run. The east wall of this room had nothing on it but a painting she couldn't identify and a sconce with warm light. She looked at it for a moment. Then she turned and moved back into the room. She did not give a speech that evening. There had been a suggestion that she should. Russo had raised it, and Pelletier had concurred, and she had declined, because a speech was the wrong instrument for this moment. A speech was for arrival. She had arrived in January, in a building on fire, without an invitation, because someone had left her in the smoke, and she had chosen not to stay there. That was the speech. Everything since then was what the speech meant. She circulated. She remembered children's names. She noted quietly which relationships needed tending and which needed space. She drank 1 glass of wine over 2 hours and ate 3 of the past hors d'oeuvres because her body had gotten very clear with her, in the last 8 weeks, about what it required to function. Near the end of the evening, she found herself in a conversation with Di Stefano, Boston, Blunt, the man who had voted yes before the motion was formally called, about a supply chain dispute in the Massachusetts corridor that had been generating friction since October. It was a genuine problem with a genuine solution that required two families to communicate through a structure that hadn't existed before January and now did. She walked him through the mechanism she had proposed to Marcia's office that morning. He listened. He asked 3 questions, all of them good ones. Then he said, "All right, that works. I'll have my people contact your office Monday." Your office. She had an office now. That was still a thing that surprised her, in small moments, not the authority, which she had constructed for herself in other forms for 11 years, but the physical fact of a room with her name attached to it, a place that held her files and her legal pads, and the organizational chart she updated every week because the landscape was always moving, because that was the nature of the thing she was now responsible for. She left the gala at 10:50. Not early. The evening was winding toward its natural close, and several other people were leaving, and she was not someone who stayed past the productive moment of any gathering. Russo walked her to the car. He did this occasionally in an informal way that was not exactly security and was not exactly sentiment. It was the habit of a man who had been in this business long enough to understand that certain gestures mattered regardless of whether they were strictly necessary. "You're doing something," he said on the sidewalk outside. "I'm doing a lot of things," she said. "Something specific." He was looking at the street, not at her, which was his way of having a direct conversation. "The last 8 weeks. It's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" He considered. "I expected someone managing a crisis, holding the line until something more traditional could be arranged." He paused. "What you're doing is building." She looked at the street with him. A cab moved past. Someone somewhere laughed, close and ordinary. "The Alliance has been running on a model that's 30 years old," she said. "The threats have changed. The relationships have changed. The way information moves has changed." She paused. "You can't hold the line with something built for a different era. You have to build something that fits what the era actually is." Russo was quiet for a moment. "You sound like your father." "My father thought emotion was a liability," she said. "I disagree with him about that. Everything else? Yes, probably." He made a sound that was the closest thing to a laugh she'd heard from him. The car came. She got in. Marco was driving. He had become, over the weeks, something in the category of a permanent assignment, though neither of them had formalized it. He was 23 and careful, and had, that night outside the Gray Stone at 3 in the morning, made the choice to follow her instruction over his standing orders, which was the kind of choice that, in this world, told you more about a person's character than almost anything else. She had put him through 3 weeks of additional training and given him a significant raise, and he had not thanked her for either, which she had taken as evidence that he understood they were not gestures of generosity, but recognitions of value, which was the correct understanding. The car moved north through the April city. The night was warmer than January. Not warm, but the kind of not warm that had the promise of something coming, the smell of something loosening in the air that New York got in early spring, when you caught it in the right 10 seconds between buildings. She had the legal pad on her knee. She had, as always, the legal pad on her knee. She wrote for 3 blocks, and then she stopped writing, and she looked out the window at the city moving past, and she let it move. And she did not think about the 4 families who hadn't voted for her, or the Draper investigation, or the Massachusetts supply chain, or the organizational chart she needed to update before Monday. She thought about the ivory room, about standing in the water from the sprinkler system with a piece of her hem in her hands, and a woman's ankle that needed wrapping, and a room full of chaos that needed a center. About the specific moment when she had stopped waiting to be found and started moving. She had been doing this work for 11 years. She had done it invisibly, in rooms adjacent to the ones where decisions were made, with the specific patience of someone who understood that the time for visibility was not a thing you could force and was not a thing you could plan for. It was a thing that arrived, and when it arrived, you had to already know what you were doing, and you had to be willing to move. The time had arrived. In fire and smoke and the specific cruelty of a public humiliation that had been designed to define her, she had moved. The car stopped at a red light on Lex. Outside, A woman was walking a dog. Not the same woman, and not the same dog as January. This was April, and the world had turned. But a woman walking a dog in the ordinary way of a city that went on moving through everything. The dog was pulling at the leash towards something in the gutter that interested it enormously. The woman was patient with it. Victoria watched them until the light changed. Then she picked up the pen and she went back to work.